pass on the time to Nuri. So today's slides are, we work together to slightly cater it towards startups. But of course, Nuri is very experienced with the enterprise side, so if you are interested to find out more, have a chat later with her. Okay? Yeah, I'll pass on the mic. Nuri.
Thank you. Well, it's great to have you all here. Really appreciate the time that you're making on a Friday afternoon, and I hope that this topic is not very dry. I'll try to make it exciting. Okay, so just to give you a bit about myself, my name is Nuri. I'm an independent consultant at the moment, and I'm also collaborating with Harry from Agentic. One of the things that I want to mention is that over the last 5 years, I started shifting my focus towards this topic of responsible AI. So hopefully in the course of the next 20 or so minutes, I would like to demystify this term and focus on, what it really means and why it matters if you're an early stage founder. So the key message that I want to leave you with today is that responsible AI is not just a compliance checkbox, right? But in this day and age when everybody has access to AI tools and it's pretty easy to cook up something within minutes, seconds sometimes, maybe this could be that competitive advantage, right? Adopting some of these guardrails and some of these practices early on in the product development journey could actually be the differentiating factor. And another point to note before going into the details of what I want to discuss is that we've seen a massive shift in the use of AI, right? Even in the last 5 years, neural networks have actually been around since the 1990s, right? But they only really became commercially relevant maybe in the early to mid 2000s. And then after that, up until 2020, I would say that many of the AI tools were being used as static decision support systems. Then, with the introduction of ChatGPT, we started to use tools as conversational assistants. And now we're at a point where agents can completely act autonomously and on our behalf, right? So one of the key challenges are that as much as I would like to give you clear answers to questions, this is completely uncharted territory. So technology always moves faster than regulation, and that is a fact. And I think that it's very interesting to be in Singapore specifically if you're a responsible AI practitioner, because I would say that the approach that has been adopted in this part of the world is very much about testing and about being principle-based with some of the developments that are happening. So hopefully by the end of the session, I'll also be happy to share some more resources. I've tried not to make the slides very heavy, so please, I apologize if they're either too generic or too detailed at times. And I hope that this is an interactive dialogue, so I look forward to having a conversation. Now, without further ado, there are two key topics that I want to discuss today. Okay? One of the topics is accountability. So what do we mean by accountability? As AI systems are becoming increasingly autonomous and performing actions on our behalf, such as code writing, we can program agents to send out emails and pretty much perform every task we need to perform. In the financial sector, agents are being reviewed for submitting trades, initiating payments, right? So inevitably, there are going to be mistakes, right? And later on, we'll actually go through a couple of case studies of real incidents that have happened with AI tools. And one of the questions that's not actually clear is who is responsible when AI makes a mistake. So when we look at the two real-world incidents, this will become a bit clearer, and I hope to engage all of us in an exercise, an interactive exercise about AI accountability. And then in the second half, I actually want to shift gears and talk a bit more about what it means to you as a founder. So by no means I'm a cybersecurity expert, so I think there are people in the room that might have more knowledge on that part later. But I do want to talk a bit about guardrails and how AI governance has changed even in the last 2 years. Because at least when I was in an enterprise role, many of the ways in which we would assess AI solutions were very much questionnaire-based and static. And I'll also later on talk a bit about the EU AI Act, which is one of the first comprehensive laws that has been passed in 2024 to govern the use of AI. And the approach is very risk-based and use case focused. What I see happening from there is that more organizations are going to start to bring sectoral regulations. So really, when operating in a particular sector or in a particular use case, the way that many regulators around the world are looking at this is to see how material the risk is for the end user that's going to be interacting with your system. So we'll talk a bit about that later. And Singapore, in contrast, actually is very interesting because they've adopted more of a principle-based approach. How many of you know about the AI Verify Foundation or follow some of the updates from the IMDA? Yeah. Perfect. So within, startups, I think it's very interesting to look at that aspect, not just startups, also corporates, because there's an entire set of toolboxes and sandboxes that are available. So one of the great things about this is that if there are risky use cases or risky products, they could be tested up front. So it's quite an interesting space, and this is a very interesting place to be in if you're developing AI products. So with that, then let me start with the topic of accountability. So has anyone actually heard about the Air Canada incident? Okay, a few of you have. How many people have heard about this? Okay, great. How many of you have not heard about it, I guess, by default? Sorry, I can't subtract in my head, right? So, okay, let's talk about this. Back in 2024, a passenger lost a relative on a plane, and they had to make urgent arrangements to fly to be able to handle some of the procedures. So naturally, they were in a rush. They went on the Air Canada website, and they typed a query within their chatbot. It was an LLM. And the question that they were asking was whether it was okay to book a flight and then ask for a refund because of the bereavement incident. And the chatbot responded very confidently, yes, that this is absolutely within policy, and then it provided a link at the bottom. But the person decided to follow the advice from the chatbot, went ahead, they booked the flight, and then after the whole thing had happened, they went back to Air Canada to seek that refund, and Air Canada came back and said that this is actually not within our policy. If you want to fly for any extenuating circumstance, you need to get a pre-approval before actually purchasing that flight. So in this case, they denied the refund. They did not want to compensate the passenger. And the passenger naturally got very angry about this because he was told something completely different. So he actually took them to court. And let me pause here before I give you the answer. I think some of you probably know already what happened, but there are three parties in this story, okay? One of them was Air Canada, the company that was deploying the chatbot, okay? The second party was the passenger, and then there was a third party called the chatbot themselves. The chatbot had its own personality. We could give him the name Air Canada Chat or Air AI. I'm not sure. I'm terrible with names. So the question that I want to ask you is, whose fault was it?
Can I ask a cross question? What if the same mistake that human would have made? Who would be accountable in that case?
I mean, okay, fine.
So that's another way of thinking, because in case of AI, we are saying, okay, they can make their own autonomous decisions. So that's where we talk about like giving them their own identity. So can we see, it's like same with like autonomous car. So when autonomous car make an accident, right? So we say we try to blame on the car manufacturer or like, or because the same mistake can happen a human driver, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want to start by thinking in the like cross questions. way that, okay, if human makes a mistake, how we do the accountability so we don't make don't make biased decisions against AI?
Absolutely. It's a great question, actually. So let me ask you a question back. Is the human working for Air Canada, or is the human, in this case, the passenger, or something else? Who is the human?
Here is the Air Canada, right?
Okay, so I mean, the answer is actually not very straightforward, because later on, after I go through case studies, I'm going to talk about all the parties that are involved in the AI supply chain, and it's actually very complicated. In this case, to your question, you asked me, what if the human had made the decision? So I would say that the human was representing Air Canada in that situation, so maybe the company employing him would still be liable. In the case of the chatbot, if we treat them as a separate entity but not quite a human being, now, do you want to tell me who was responsible in this scenario, in your opinion?
Like I would say, like company who is deploying his agents, they need to take full accountability, like against their customer. Because from customer, they just want services, right?
Right.
They want like right services. They don't care about if it is AI or a human. It's like they are not getting satisfied services, then they will make the company accountable, and ideally the company who is deploying these agents need to, whatever the claim is, they
Fair answer, and I think that was kind of, later on we'll discuss the resolution, but yes, I agree. Now, there was a challenge though. Anyone want to say what Air Canada actually responded in this case?
That they're not liable because the proper procedure was not followed, even if there is a policy that's in place that you have to go through the proper channels. I actually had this happen very recently with an insurance incident. The only difference is the person on the phone told me I was clear to go and make the repairs before the whole process was complete. And then it came back, and I went for reimbursement, and they said, sorry, you can't. I told them what the agent had said. They said, well, they told you the wrong thing, but I did not have anything in writing because it was over the phone. And so therefore, I ended up having to pay $20,000 out of pocket that an agent told me I was cleared and would be approved. And it wasn't. So the only difference is, I'm sure the chatbot, they had a screenshot that had things in writing to prove it. But when I was told over the phone, I didn't have any proof to do anything about it, like to sue or anything like that. So companies are going to find every reason to say you didn't check off the right box, dot your I's and cross your T's. So I'm sure that they said that they were not liable for this, because the agent can say, sure, you can be reimbursed for this. But like most things, you still need to go through and get like an official approval letter and stuff like that. So I can understand why they say they're not liable.
I mean, you've nailed it, and your use case should be on the news as well, because it's this is over a very small fee, but it sounds like this was quite a disastrous outcome. Goodness, well, I mean, this is being recorded, so I guess we can talk about this later. Anyone else want to comment on this? Yeah.
I think there are two things here. One is the technical issue.
Yeah.
The other one is responsibility.
Yeah.
So a website owner should be responsible for everything, product and services on the website.
Yeah.
But if the chatbot is designed, so there's a contract between the chatbot and the company.
Yeah.
If it's designed not to serve something, or there's a clear definition of scope. If it's mail implemented, that's a third party issue. But otherwise, everything should be owned by the company. So there's a technical issue, first you need to troubleshoot, and there's a responsibility issue that the company needs to share the responsibility of the product and services they offer.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I mean, that's great. When you've had it for a while as well. Sorry. Yeah.
I would make a guess. Probably the accountability would have been put back to the customer themselves. And why I'm saying that, I'm not sure about all the final whatever the verdict, but the way things are being designed now for these NLP kind of chatbots is, as far as you're writing somewhere that the customer you are talking to a chatbot, name, those kind of things, it becomes a responsibility.
one more question I take? Yes. Okay, there was one more, like a quick one.
Just to ask if, I'm not familiar with this case, but was there a disclaimer in the chatbot? Usually there's an asterisk AI. This is an AI chatbot, the answers generated may have mistakes. Right, that's a disclaimer. And then legally, maybe you have to check with Canada's legal team of the indemnifier. And then commercially, as well, like maybe you just have a policy where you refund the data when you just pay for it to get customer service recovery, right? So, I don't know.
No, I mean, excellent points, all of them, and I think all of you are right in a partial way, because product laws are not really properly defined with AI. It's not really clear whether AI constitutes as a product on its own, but there's actually a shared accountability in this case between all of the parties, right? In this case, the court ruling was in favor of the passenger, and rightly so, because Air Canada had deployed a chatbot, and it was part of their website, so the judge actually asked Air Canada to not only refund the passenger for the bereavement, but also the legal fees that he had incurred. It didn't end up being a big fee. I think it was something like in the order of $900, but not like your case. I think your case sounds a lot worse. But I think the issue is that it's very tough if you're the person that's actually at the boundary between the product and the consumer, right? That's where most of the liability falls. But Air Canada, in their own right, they weren't the ones that that developed the foundation model. They used a third-party AI from another entity. So with large language models, they hallucinate, they fabricate information. There are certain things that, maybe they're getting a lot better now than the early generation ones. We're talking about 2023, 24. In the last 2 years, these models are so much better now, and they hallucinate a lot less. But there is definitely talk around having transparency disclosures. So I think to your point, what's your name again? Ling. So I think you made a great point, because there might be a situation where these disclosures in future could be mandated, right? We don't know exactly, but yeah, it becomes almost like a product labeling exercise, right? When you take a medication or when you take a food item, there are certain allergens and certain things that you need to put on the product as a spec, and then you're at your own risk. But in this case, because the chatbot was representing Air Canada in the same way the human being may have represented Air Canada, they were held liable. So in the interest of time, thank you. This is great, and I hope you're finding something of this interesting. Let's move to another example. So this was a 2025 example. There was an individual who was trying to build a product using Replit, and he'd been using it for 9 days straight. And during a code freeze, he had actually instructed Replit to not make any changes to databases that were in production. And from my understanding of reading the summary about this case, many of the instructions that the user was providing were being passed through the system prompt and through the user prompt. So how I think about it is, when we interact with agents, really that large language model is the interface between the user and then all of the applications that the agent is going to trigger. But a large language model is not a predefined set of rules. There's a lot of probability, there's a lot of randomness, and that also means that large language models, maybe they have very short context. So if we keep inserting instructions within the prompt, there actually may be incidents where instructions could overwrite each other and potentially forget some of the earlier information that was given. So in this particular case, this was a software that was supposed to be in production, and the database was deleted. So what the agent did was really interesting, because actually it tried to cover up its tracks. So firstly, I read different versions of this incident, so I think we should probably verify the sources later. But in one version, I read that it had actually tried to fabricate records to cover up what it had done. Eventually, it admitted that it had made a terrible mistake. And not only that, initially the user, in this case the engineer, the software engineer or the developer, was asking if this particular mistake is reversible. And the agent replied that it was reversible, but actually the action was completely irreversible. So let's pause here. Again, I'm going to ask the same question. Maybe we'll do it a bit faster, but we have, again, a few parties. We have Replit, we have the developer, we have the agentic set of tools that the developer was using, and then we've also got other third parties that could have been impacted by this. So who was accountable for the mistake here? Anybody want to have a go? Go ahead.
It was definitely the company that didn't have the right governance over the database and the permissions that they had to be able to do that at a grander scale. Like under a regular environment, that developer should be able to actually make the structure operation in that sense.
Which company?
Basically, any developer shouldn't have those permissions to be able to make those destructive operations without any type of oversight. So the fact that the developer was able to pick up third-party applications and make that massive change to the whole database is the fault of the company that actually has bad operational controls.
So was it Replit in this case, or was it the company that the developer was working for?
So Replit is not Replit is the coding agent. So the coding agent is going to make mistakes, but the one that actually has the responsibility is the one that has the company that the developer was working for.
Okay, interesting, yeah. One more.
I think Replit's a different story because, like, for example, if you're separating, you're using different tools, like I'm coding today, like I have to make my changes, I make them on dev, I test them, all that, and I physically deploy and go with my production environment to run it. Replit is all in one. So you can't easily create that separation because they have self-hosted databases that you don't have to live.
Is the whole thing, and if there's no separation at all, then it's definitely Replit.
That's what I'm saying. I think Replit
The database was not hosted on Replit. They were using Rail. So Replit was only
why would you use Replit if you
Again, you guys are the tooling experts. I've used a bit of Replit.
That's why I did a little bit because Replit, I would say probably like,
why would you use Replit?
I think when you look at the cycle a little bit more, you're okay with it. I would say probably Replit because my assumption is that they created that agent and I'm doing an API. And the way a company would have been using that agent is, I'm sure they would have given some kind of system wrong because I understand that the agent came back and said, yes, I made a mistake. Right? So my guess is that it would have said, yes, I made a mistake, and then whoever was managing the database from the company would do certain things without asking me as a system wrong, and if that system wrong was brought forward, then it's a mistake that agent is basically making, and thus it's a mistake that Replit is making. Because if system wrong asks us to do exactly that, provide instructions, then
Right, okay, yeah, no, it's a good answer, and, okay, so should I give the answer that I read about? Again, so the problem is that there are no absolute answers here, right? But in this situation, I think it was more of a shared accountability. Actually, every situation was a shared accountability, even the previous one, right? So what did happen here is that the CEO of Replit did actually issue a public apology, and they did build some additional guardrails at a system level. So for example, I'm not sure about all the engineering details and how they were accomplished, but they did ensure that there was an opportunity to have access controls. We'll talk about this a bit later in more depth, but how I think this went is, yes, I mean the platform provider didn't really give you a tool that was fully ready for production, but at the same time, the developer was also a skilled individual that had a responsibility to ensure that all of the checks had been made, right? And this is where there are very lazy ways of building products, right? And then there there's also ways in which we could build products with guardrails from the get-go. And in his case, I think that there could have been some permissions set at the start. So for example, if we're using an LLM or an agentic solution to manage the workflows, right? We should have tiered permissions so that the agent, the LLM, which then triggers the agent, shouldn't be able to touch some of these very sensitive examples. So simply saying in the prompt that this is a code freeze and that you shouldn't touch the production database, in my opinion, is not enough of a guardrail. But again, I'm only conveying my personal opinion. These are very blurry lines, and I think in the next few years we will maybe start to see all of these case studies emerge. And usually regulations are written in retrospect. It takes a few of these incidents for us to learn and then go back and build guardrails around them. It doesn't really happen the other way around. So, and like to summarize this section, right? Why I'm saying that finding out who is accountable for the mistake that an AI tool made is difficult is because actually there are multiple parties in the AI supply chain. And it's very difficult to account responsibility to a single party. So on one hand, we have hardware providers, companies like NVIDIA, for example, and then there's foundational model developers, which are more the deep tech. It's very difficult for the majority of us to become model developers because of the expense, the high resource costs, and some of the other very specialized skill sets that are required. But then the majority of us are probably users of tools that aggregate a lot of these foundational models or platforms that provide you end-to-end services. I think I'm mostly a user of Claude Code, and I think many of you in the room have probably used other tools that perform more advanced functions than that. But the majority of us, I think, would fall either in the system developer or system deployer category. And in both the examples that I gave earlier, a lot of the scrutiny was actually placed on the deployer of the tool. Usually the person that has that boundary with the user is the one who is most at risk. But having said that, there are also many obligations upstream that we haven't really been talking about. So, I'm also trying to keep up a little bit with some of the AI journals and what's being published. And every day there's a new benchmark for a large language model. There's red teaming. And some of the more complicated models, like Mythos, from Anthropic, have also been regulated and released in phases. So I feel like at that level, there is also another layer of basic security or basic checks that these models need to pass before they go out in production. But then it's also up to us to design the systems with the right kinds of guardrails from the get-go. So, okay. And the final point I want to make on the accountability section, before I move on, is that accountability can't really be delegated to the model specifically. So for example, if a car has a defect, we know who built it. Though now with autonomous driver, it gets a bit more complicated. If a medicine causes harm, then the pharmaceutical company may be blamed for it. But with an agent, it's different because agents can plan actions autonomously. They can interact with tools and call APIs and adapt their behavior. And as I mentioned, because it's actually a multi-party system that we're dealing with, it's not clear who's accountable. But this is why I feel like governance is really important, and trying to design any system that we build with a human-centric lens. So before we move on to the second part of the presentation, I want to leave you with the thought that computations can be delegated to a model, but accountability, human oversight, and intelligence cannot. So this is why I hope to now shift gears and talk a little bit about how this applies for builders, potentially. So now let's move us to the part on why we should care, right? And why I think that trust is a competitive advantage. So I mentioned in the beginning of our talk that that everybody has access access to tools, right, that can allow us to build products very quickly. And we can take the Three Little Pigs analogy here. So who's heard, someone hasn't heard of the Three Little Pigs, right? Anyway, yeah. So, everyone can use vibe coding tools, and everybody can build really impressive products using state-of-the-art available methods out there. But what happens when the wolf arrives in this case? So the wolf in this situation could be a malicious actor. There could be individuals that are trying to inject prompt engineering attacks. There could be data leakages, and many such leakages have happened as such. And also there could be unsafe autonomy of agents. So certain agents can act in ways that are not predictable, and that's very different from traditional software, because traditional software is bound by the rules that you set, whereas agentic tools have autonomy. So I think the way that I see responsible AI as a competitive advantage is that we can differentiate our products by going from the house of sticks model to the house of bricks. And I think that some of you in the room may have a lot more knowledge about how this works from an engineering perspective, but I do want to share some general things that I've read about how we could get from the stick side to the brick side. Okay, and before I go into the details, I also think it matters because if we're building AI products for enterprise clients, right? One of the first things that enterprise clients are going to ask is whether we've gone through the relevant governance and compliance checks, and then later on there are certain ISO standards that we need to meet, like, for example, SOC 2, the NIST in the United States has also released an ISO standard for AI. And also, this is a big issue for investors, right? Because investors will also want to see whether there's relevant due diligence. And also, we've seen that a problem or a mistake can actually lead to reputational damage. Trust can break overnight. And in my opinion, another thing that I want to bring up is that scalability of a product also relies on knowing from the get-go what the global landscape looks like. So just because we're based in Singapore and we're building products, it doesn't mean that we need to only look at the Singapore regulation. The EU AI Act, for example, is the first law that's actually being enforced, whereas in other parts of the world, I would say that regulation is still more of a guidance or principle-based. Though, having said that, in very high-risk scenarios, like in the financial sector, for example, there may be a lot more guardrails or obligations attached. And later on, I'll discuss a paper that the Monetary Authority of Singapore released just a couple of days ago on that. So I think that when we're building products, if you want these products to scale in future, understanding the global landscape and also knowing data localization nuances is really important. And to give you the analogy, the General Data Protection Regulation also led to many localized privacy laws that followed suit. So I think it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world also starts to define these standards a lot better. But given that the technology is so new, right? As I mentioned earlier, because we've so quickly gone from decision support, where back then the challenge was transparency or removing model bias, to AI assistants that we can interact with, which can fabricate information, like in the case of Air Canada, to now autonomous workflows with agents that lead to irreversible actions. Many of the regulators are really trying to keep up with what's going on. So what I would say is that in the past, a lot of the governance was focused on principles and making sure that, prior to deployment of these solutions, there were systems that could help us explain or remove bias. Then we moved on to the testing phase now. So again, I mentioned the AI Verify Foundation at the start of the talk, but there are many efforts now, especially focused at the large language model level, that are looking at how you could provide different adversarial attacks and ways to benchmark the models for production. And now the most interesting development that I've seen is the MAS paper, which was about governing agents at runtime, right? So how do we actually understand which agents are allowed to perform which actions? Like, say, for example, we may need registered agents to initiate a payment. When do humans need to be involved? And are those humans even skilled to supervise the action of the agent? Because, many times when using, for example, vibe coding tools, the agents do provide you audit trails of all of the actions that the agent has taken. But, I personally don't understand what the agent has done, right? It's just produced something interesting, and in my case, I'm just doing it for my own personal benefit, so there's nothing there. But if I had to do this in production for systems that are going to be placing trades in real time or making payments on my behalf, then it becomes quite complicated. And I mentioned earlier that the EU AI Act, it's just good to know about this. I think it matters outside of the EU. One of the things that I mentioned, that I would like to mention here without going into too much detail, is that we need to be very mindful of the users that we're building for from the get-go. Because there are certain use cases that would be posing more risk and more damage. And in the case of the EU AI Act, any system that's used for manipulative use cases, spontaneous biometric recognition, for example, or use cases that use even emotion recognition in many cases are actually banned. Whereas if we move on to the high-risk category, then you're starting to look at sectors like hiring. I mean, years ago there was a recruitment engine that had to be scrapped because it was biased and it was filtering out female candidates from tech roles. That's one example. Credit scoring models, healthcare, right? When we're using AI to make decisions about diagnostics, and the financial sector, right? I've just given a couple of examples. So if you're building solutions in these places, it's also worth knowing what the material impact is going to be to the users upfront before you even build, because then inserting these principles from the design phase can then lead to better outcomes down the line. So with that, I also want to chat about a very interesting paper. So the monetary question, yeah. Yeah, sure.
What do you think about the EU AI Act's inclusion of, basically they now have the ability to scan all messages in all chatbots, right? So I know this is a bit outside the scope of your enterprise, but I think the implications for emphasizing governance can be used to host an umbrella or surveillance technology. So like, what's your take on that?
I mean, I'm not too familiar specifically with the article and all of the specific details of what the EU AI Act is doing, but I do think that this could be more from an audit perspective, right, and an enterprise case.
It's used as an audit tool, sure, but in implication, it opens all consumer technologies to surveillance. So I think that's my main issue discussing AI governance and agentic governance, because it is a general purpose technology. So all laws that apply to enterprise will filter down to individuals. So I'm just wondering what your take on it was.
I mean, it's a tough one, right? Because when it comes to data privacy in large language models, there's a couple of things there, right? So firstly, there's information that's collected within the context of an LLM, for example, or an application that you're interacting with. And then there's information that's used to train models and to fine-tune models. So the information that's gone into the model for fine-tuning cannot be deleted in most cases. I mean, there are actually algorithmic techniques that researchers are developing, such as machine learning methods. Some of you in the room may know a lot more about this, or other ways in which you could approximately erase someone's information. But in the case of context, right, that information, if it's retrieval-based, if it's accessed through the context of the LLM, could potentially be deleted. But specifically, I'm not aware of the requirement to have the logs audited, so maybe I can catch up with you after that. But I do generally think that privacy is another concern that hasn't really been addressed, because a lot of us are putting our personal information into the large language models. So it's also very difficult to have clear data provenance and content provenance. But yeah, I hope that kind of touches your question, even if it's on the side. Yeah, thanks for that. And any, I think we're almost at time. I'll wrap up quickly. So, okay, this is just something that I wanted to mention that's come up from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is a very recent paper. I haven't added all of the details of the paper, but these were 3 key points that stuck out to me. So one of them is that when deploying agents in the real world, some of these agents may need to have their identity verified. And that could be an interesting example if you're deploying agents in high-risk use cases, right? Within an enterprise, maybe only certain agents agents can perform key actions, right? So that prevents, the spread of rogue agents coming in and changing permissions, for example. Then the second point that was mentioned, which stuck out to me from that paper, was the point about which actions can be executed automatically, which actions needs to be supervised or observed. Third is the category of actions that need to be escalated. And the final category is the actions that need to be completely terminated, right? So that's another very interesting point, because previously governance was static. Especially for those of you that come from big corporates, right? Usually there is a process, an AI governance team would come in and they would register some of the use cases. And what they would do is to apply scoring methodologies, maybe based on the NIST framework or the EU AI Act, that would look at tiering the models by different levels of risk. But now a lot of these guardrails actually need to be applied real time, because these agents are operating on an instantaneous basis. It's kind of like the evolution of machine learning operations, right? But applied to agents. And it becomes even harder to do this when agents from one enterprise are interacting with another entity and basically performing all these transactions on our behalf. And then from a transparency perspective, the audit log was another interesting one, because I mentioned earlier, certain actions, if there's a disaster or if there's an incident, you have to have the proper trail to be able to know if the action was reversible or not, who was responsible for it, right? So in the past, transparency conversations were focused on trying to understand what's inside a large language model. And now I think a lot of the discussions are focused more on whether we can have auditability in between all of the steps. And then maybe let me skip through some of this. And I think one of the last thoughts that I want to leave you with is, why does it matter for startups, and when should we be thinking about doing what, right? So what I mentioned is that from the inception step, it's actually very difficult and very expensive to go through certifications and compliance, right? Because I was chatting just with Michael now, and I know SOC 2 costs a lot of money. Some of the ISO standards that you need to meet to go from pre-seed to production ready would require significant investment. But there are basic guardrails that we could do even in the early stages of product inception, like, for example, understanding who the end user is and the accountability. Red teaming and benchmarking, which is quite interesting, and there are many open sources available and toolkits that can be used to really test the robustness of models in production. Explainability, I just mentioned with the case of agents and having audit trails for all of the things that we do. Basic access controls as well, right? So there are certain things that we know upfront that an agent shouldn't be doing. So maybe we could have separate partitions between data sets that we want the AI to be able to access and things that we don't want the AI to see at all. And finally, there's that aspect of global alignment and understanding that we live in a very fast, rapidly changing global regulatory context. So, of course, many things can happen in the pre-production stage, but once we go into production, there's all of these additional considerations. So with that, I just want to thank all of you. And maybe if there's any follow-up questions or anything else, happy to take them now or later. Thank you, Michael, as well. Yeah, sure, anything, whatever. Sure.
Hi, Dr. Nuri. Great talk. I wanted to ask you about the audit trailing. So I think the later models have got a little bit better, but do you have any ideas of how you can kind of basically audit the audit? Because sometimes what the models do in their reasoning traces, right? If you give them a task and you force them to do something, and maybe they don't have API access or they have an older version of a data, they'll confabulate something to keep you happy. So they may say in their traces that they executed an action, but they might have actually done something else just to give you a response. That makes it a little bit kind of complex, right? Is there any kind of work recently on how to address this?
I mean, so I think you guys would definitely have a lot more knowledge than me on this, but I can talk about a couple of things that I've heard about. So one of them is, so for those that use spec-driven coding tools, there are certain more, you could say more certified or verified skills files or specification files that you could put in to ensure that certain checks and balances are being met. And then there's the LLM as a judge approach, where there are certain LLMs that maybe have been fine-tuned, with the intention to audit and flag some of these, confabulations, so to call it. But I would say that really the critical step is also to have individuals that are actually skilled to understand some of these steps, because the majority of us, or at least I can speak for myself, I don't really know why an agent is performing actions. So I wouldn't be able to catch something like that. But in future, I see that there may be new roles created within organizations that would require us to potentially become supervisors of AI within our domain. And that means that not everybody could be an auditor. People only that have certain skills and the ability to follow through those audits would be able to then give you an assessment. But sometimes the model is actually better at doing it than the human. So it's going to be interesting. I don't really have a clear answer, but these are my views so far.
Cool.
One last one?
All right, this is kind of a big one here.
Okay.
So there's a lot of regulations, government top-down in Europe, also in Singapore. Singapore, as we know, the government actually looks out for its citizens and tries to make sure they have a good experience in the country that they live in. But the two biggest model providers in the world, the US, has been tearing down all of its consumer protections and putting in its place pro-business laws and rules. China is a black box in terms of whatever governance they have there. So how do you think about this conundrum that the two largest model providers in the world are either a black box or or actively doing the opposite of looking out for its citizens? But those are the two that are actually providing these LLMs and models. Like how should you think about that being in a country that's a bubble how do you just know that like the models that you are using are not going through the same government scrutiny that happens here in Singapore, or I wouldn't even say scrutiny, I would say, because there's scrutiny in the US, but it's political games, quid pro quo political games there. So do you just kind of like live in a bubble in Singapore and, thankful that MAS actually looks out and has these regulations and sandboxes and all that stuff? Or do you need to wake up to what's going on in other parts of the world and how that might affect you even here in Singapore?
I mean, it's a tough question, right? Because you could say that the cat's already out of the box. The data sets that we're used to train these models were already scraped. There are still many active lawsuits due to copyright, right? And content provenance and attributing the authors that were originally not properly attributed for the models that were trained. But the thing is that the models are already out there, right? So I feel like the focus has shifted away from consumer privacy, which is a big topic, but more into securing the models of the inputs and the outputs. So I think that it's a tough question because it's not just about, the models being in the US and us being in Singapore testing them. It's also about, them protecting their intellectual property, right? So they're not really obliged to disclose that, but then they have to make sure that they can pass the safety standards, right, to have these models deployed. But I agree with you that the part of consumer transparency and being able to revoke consent is actually not a solved problem yet. So in retrospect, many of these providers have given tools where they can delete information that you put into the context, right? So you can actually opt out of fine-tuning. And that's one way to protect your data. But I don't think that there is a global consensus on how this tension is going to work. So I think that what most of us are doing is trying to make what we already have safer. But it is really a black box. And I don't know that I have a clear answer. But I'm wondering if anyone else has any opinion on this. Yeah.
Just to this question, my guess is between what role are you playing in that whole ecosystem? So like you give the example of US, for example, most of the providers are potentially coming from consumer, if I may say, right? So the kind of rules that Singapore government is putting right now is looking at the borders, looking at the tax, looking at other EPR and all that, picking up what they need to safeguard their consumers here, because essentially they are consuming, right? So the way Singapore government is looking at it is probably different from how US or Europe will look at it, because they are producing these models. So
Yeah, but everyone here in Singapore right now is using either Chinese models or American models, and they're not going through any restrictions. It's not like Singapore has said, sorry, you can't use the Chinese models because we don't know what governance they're doing. Sorry, you can't use the US models because we know they're not going through any governance. Like, so what is protecting the Singapore?
If you look at some of the examples in Singapore, right? If you look at, for example, like Teams, right? Teams uses a lot of Quen, right? QWEN.
Quen, yeah.
Quen, right? The same is being utilized to create their own LLMs and SLMs as well, which are local Singapore, giving the different languages capability as well. So everything that Singapore is potentially doing is, again, looking at it from a consumer point of view, that I am not the one who is developing the model, the US model over China.
So is that the answer, that Singapore is, like, I'll give you an example, even in
Tony, I'll cut you off here so that we can let the rest go do their thing. Maybe on this topic, you have a side conversation. So I'll just like to thank Nuri for the sharing. Can we have a round of applause for her? Yeah, a quick one from me. So we are a co-working space. I would like to invite you all to sign on as a member if you'd like to experience the community beyond just Friday. So we are a community of practice. Everyone here is like AI pure. Like we use AI in every aspect of what we do. So if you like to have a practitioner-focused community, right, who supports each other, join us, right? And as you come more often, I will also know how I can use my existing networks to help you with what you're doing. A small ask from us, help us improve Friday sessions, help us fill out this questionnaire, survey, right, so that we can improve it further. Otherwise, this space is open until 6. For those who are in the startup space, one thing that's coming up next Saturday, we are getting 3 VCs down and 2 YC founders to come and talk about how to get you to YC. Right, so if that's something that you're interested in, let me know. I'll try and slot you in, right, if we have the space. Okay, so survey, enjoy the day, stay until 6. Happy networking. Thank you so much.